human hands in a stockpot. A gruesome discovery in the home of Joel Michael Jr. left police asking, how did this young man, seemingly just a financially dependent son, descend into such horror? The answers lie not just in the crime scene, but in a meticulously planned notebook, a series of chilling internet searches, and a motive most people would never see coming. What drives someone to murder their own parents? The shocking details of this premeditated act will leave you speechless. Please like the video and subscribe. Let's get to it. The neighborhood was quiet, the late November chill settling into Knoxville, Tennessee. But inside the Guy family home, a scene of unimaginable horror waited to be uncovered. Police officers arrived that evening for what should have been a routine welfare check. Joel and Lisa Guy hadn't been seen or heard from following Thanksgiving, and their concerned relatives reached out to law enforcement. At first, the call didn't raise any alarms. It wasn't unusual for elderly couples to head out for the weekend, but as officers approached the house and stepped through the front door, the atmosphere shifted. Something was immediately off. The home, a modest two-story house, was eerily silent except for the faint hum of appliances. It didn't take long for officers to notice what shouldn't have been there. Faint smears of blood around the hallway. It wasn't overt, almost as if someone had tried to clean up but left behind traces. As officers followed the strange, irregular stains deeper into the home, the unsettling signs multiplied. The smell hit them next, thick, sharp, unmistakable. Instinctively, they knew they had walked into something far worse than anyone had expected. They moved towards the kitchen, where most of the unnatural odor seemed to be originating. At the same time, their radios buzzed quietly in the background, but none of them said a word to each other. They paused at the doorway, gathering themselves before stepping inside. What they found changed not only their perception of the case, but likely stayed with them for life. Sitting on the stove was a large stock pot. It was worn from years of use, the rounded edges slightly discolored from scratches and heat. At first glance, it didn't stand out entirely. Pots on stoves are, after all, a standard sight in any home. But this one wasn't filled with stew or leftovers. Inside the pot, detectives would later confirm, were human hands. Thick, bubbling liquid obscured the details, but there was no refuting the evidence that these were fragments of someone's body. Officers stood frozen for a moment, both horrified and transfixed. The thing sitting innocuously on a stovetop was evidence of something far darker than any of them had anticipated. The gnawing stench wasn't the only thing in the air. There was a heavy sense of dread that hung over the room, an almost tangible weight pressing down as police began to piece together what they were facing. Blood pooled beneath the kitchen counters, where it seemed to have seeped into the cracks and edges of the flooring. The scene wasn't chaotic, that's what made it all the more disturbing. It was deliberately constructed. The careful placement of certain items, the unnerving cleanliness in some areas, and, of course, the focal point of the stockpot suggested a crime not committed in a fit of rage, but with methodical calculation. The officers called in more investigators, securing the home as a crime scene, and beginning their grim task of processing what lay in front of them. They couldn't yet know what else they would find, but there was no doubt that they were stepping into one of the most grotesque cases their city had ever seen. The stockpot, horrifying as it was, turned out to be only the surface layer of depravity. As forensic specialists moved further into the house, the unsettling discoveries continued. It wasn't just hands that the killer had manipulated. There were portions of the bodies hidden elsewhere, placed in containers filled with harsh chemicals. The intention was clear: dissolve every trace of the victims, eliminate all evidence. But there had been missteps in execution. Blood soaked through towels and leaked under furniture. The makeshift disposal sites weren't as effective as whoever orchestrated this scene had imagined. Every step unraveling the house revealed more that couldn't be erased. The original call had been to check on Joel and Lisa Guy, a devoted couple loved by neighbors and family alike. But now, the focus had shifted entirely to the question, who could have possibly done this? And why? The answers were beginning to take shape, but were no less unsettling. Clues scattered among everyday household items quickly painted a chilling picture. Investigators couldn't ignore the strange sense of contrast in the home. Photographs of Joel and Lisa, smiling together on family vacations, still hung neatly on the walls. Handwritten notes and holiday-themed decor gave the house a comfortable, welcoming air. Yet, right beside these touches of warmth were the cold, callous remnants of violence beyond reason. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on anyone sifting through the scene. The home felt like it was caught mid-transition, one step in its identity as the peaceful gathering place it had always been, and another in its precipitous slide into a macabre crime scene. Soon, the true scale of the horror became evident. Joel Guy Sr. had suffered dozens of stab wounds, many of which appeared to have been inflicted with ferocity. The autopsy would later reveal he had several defensive wounds, showing that he had fought back against his killer. His body had been dismembered, with portions stored in various parts of the home. Some had already begun the chemical decomposition process the killer had initiated. Lisa Guy, too, had been brutally attacked. She had no chance to react. Her ambush had come the moment she walked through the door. She was found in conditions just as horrifying, tissues and organs left visible, decomposing slowly in chemical solutions. Back in the kitchen, the stockpot lingered as the most startling symbol of the brutality that had occurred here. Detectives puzzled over its presence and significance. Was it purely functional, used as part of the killer's failed attempt to erase evidence, or was it something else altogether, a symbol, a grotesque statement left behind in a moment of arrogance or indifference? The questions, along with the rest of the scene, presented an enigma. At the heart of this nightmare was a single, unshakable query. Who could be capable of such an act, and why target Joel and Lisa? By all accounts, the guys had been hard-working, unassuming people with no known enemies. The investigation would eventually bring the answers, but their origins shocked everyone involved. It wasn't an outsider, an intruder, or even a distant rival. The person responsible for this carnage had lived among them, blending within the very fabric of their family. More peculiar discoveries would add layers to the case in the days ahead. A scattered collection of tools and chemicals suggested long-term planning. Receipts for supplies and surveillance footage pointed detectives toward a single suspect, Joel Guy Jr., the couple's son. This was no crime of passion or an unplanned outburst. It was a calculated, sinister act designed to reap financial gain. But as the pieces were gathered, questions about Joel Jr.'s true motives would only deepen. What lay ahead for investigators was far more intricate than solving how the crime had occurred. It would take understanding a person who had the composure to execute something so horrifying, yet the short-sightedness to still leave enough evidence for police to trace his every step. The brutality of the crime stood in sharp contrast to its strangely sloppy execution. Ultimately, this case wasn't just about the acts committed within those walls. It was about the fractured dynamics in a family seemingly held together by obligation rather than love, dynamics that had festered until they had torn everything apart. Back at the scene, though, one thought dominated: the stockpot. As officers packed up for the night and specialists catalogued every grisly item, the stove sat quiet again, retired from its role in a story no one could erase from their minds. It wasn't just a crime scene artifact. It marked the starting point for one of the most disturbing investigations the state of Tennessee had ever seen. Joel Guy Sr. and Lisa Guy were a hard-working couple who had spent decades building a stable and comfortable life together. Married for over 30 years, the two had weathered the challenges of raising a blended family and were now approaching a new chapter in their lives, one they had been dreaming of for years: retirement. With their youngest children grown and living on their own, Joel and Lisa had decided it was time to downsize. They were preparing to leave their Knoxville, Tennessee, home and relocate to a smaller property in Sirville, where they planned to enjoy a quiet, more peaceful lifestyle. Like many families, Joel and Lisa were looking forward to enjoying this new phase together, focused on relaxation and time for one another. Part of their plan for retirement, however, included making some tough changes in how they supported their adult children, particularly their son Joel Michael Guy Jr., or Joel Jr., as he was known to the family. At 28 years old, Joel Jr. still depended entirely on his parents for financial support. For much of his adult life, he had relied on Lisa, who not only paid all of his bills but also supported his college education, his car, his apartment in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and virtually every other responsibility an independent adult would typically manage for themselves. It wasn't uncommon for Lisa to juggle household expenses for her family in Knoxville, while also sending money or covering basic necessities for her son. Joel Jr. had attended Louisiana State University for several years, but he dropped out in 2015 without finishing his degree. Since then, he had not sought employment, opting instead to continue living on support from his parents. Though he left college, Joel Jr. did not appear to have a clear plan for what would come next in his life, nor did he seem interested in shouldering any of the responsibilities of adulthood. As Lisa continued paying for his apartment, his utilities, his groceries, and more, the dynamic between mother and son began to cause strain on the family. For Joel and Lisa, it was clear that this level of financial support was not sustainable. especially with retirement on the horizon. At their age, retirement meant reducing their workload and focusing on maintaining the funds they had saved over a lifetime. Joel Sr. had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, and Lisa balanced her duties at home with her care for Joel Jr.'s ongoing needs. They simply could not continue carrying the financial burden of a grown child indefinitely. By Thanksgiving 2016, the guys had made the difficult decision to no longer support Joel Jr. financially. Sources close to the family later revealed that Joel Sr. had planned to sit Joel Jr. down over Christmas to explain that it was time for him to become fully independent. The plan would be firm, addressing everything from his rent to his groceries, expenses Joel Jr. had never before handled on his own. Joel Sr. believed it was time for his son to take responsibility for himself, but both parents knew that this might create tension, as Joel Jr. did not react well to discussions about finances. That Thanksgiving was also significant because it was the last family gathering the guys planned to host at their Knoxville home. With the move to Serville quickly approaching, Joel and Lisa welcomed their children and grandchildren to celebrate the holiday as one final farewell to their house of many years. It should have been a joyful moment, a chance to reflect, connect, and celebrate together. But not all was as it seemed. Joel Jr. made the journey from Baton Rouge to Knoxville to attend Thanksgiving with the family. He did not bring much with him, just a few personal items, which gave the impression that his visit would be brief. Throughout the holiday, several family members noted that Joel Jr. was acting differently than they had seen before. Normally reserved and quiet, Joel Jr. was known for keeping to himself during family gatherings. However, during this particular Thanksgiving, he seemed more engaged. He spent extra time talking with family members and even interacted more with his nieces and nephews than usual. For his half-sister, Michelle Tyler, his unusually friendly behavior was noticeable enough for her to mention it later. At the same time, Joel Jr.'s demeanor was not entirely easy to read. There was something weighted in his presence. Beyond his surface-level attempts at sociability, he gave little indication of his deeper thoughts or intentions. It seemed that his mother and father were the only people with whom he felt entirely familiar. After all, they had been his primary source of support for his entire life. Yet, even with their efforts to maintain a connection, the upcoming financial changes created an invisible wedge between Joel Jr. and his parents. Joel Jr. didn't have to be told outright that his parents' financial support was about to end. He was well aware of their plans to retire and move, and he likely knew that his reliance on them could not continue forever. Whether directly from his parents or by his own assumptions, he understood the implications of their decision to downsize. For someone like Joel Jr., who had avoided responsibility for so long, this knowledge stirred feelings of resentment and, perhaps even more deeply, fear. Without their help, his lifestyle in Baton Rouge car, the apartment, the groceries would crumble. Lisa, like any mother, wanted to see her son succeed, but supporting him had become a delicate balance between love and enabling. She had continued to provide for him financially because she cared, but this dynamic did not guarantee that Joel Jr. felt the same in return. To Joel Jr., Lisa may have become less a mother offering care and more of an extension of the resources he needed for his survival. These twisted dynamics played a role in what was to come. As Thanksgiving came to an end that year, Joel Jr. prepared to leave Knoxville and return to Baton Rouge. He showed no outward signs that he harbored any resentment or was distressed. But in the days following the holiday, Joel Jr.'s quiet facade gave way to something much more sinister. The seeds of conflict that had been planted, either from directly hearing his parents' plans or from piecing them together in his mind, began to grow. Joel Sr. and Lisa's choice to prioritize their retirement over continuing to fund their adult son's lifestyle led to a series of thoughts and decisions in Joel Jr. that no one but him could have predicted. The tension within the family had been brewing for some time, but now it reached a boiling point. Joel Jr. had always lived with a degree of secrecy, keeping much of his life in Baton Rouge private from the rest of the family. He did not regularly update his parents about his goals, his friendships, or his routines. In hindsight, this secrecy may have been a warning. As Joel Jr. retreated into himself in the days after Thanksgiving, his actions became calculated. Planning, preparation, and silence marked the days leading up to what he would do next. For most of his life, Joel Jr. had been cared for in every regard, particularly by Lisa, who had provided for even his smallest needs. The idea of losing this support likely left a void he didn't know how to fill. But rather than adapt to the circumstances and accept the challenge of independence, Joel Jr. chose a path that defied logic, morality, and any semblance of love for his family. As he made his way back home, Joel Jr. didn't return in defeat or despair. He returned with a carefully forming plan. The distance that had grown between him and his parents wasn't only emotional. It had become a mental chasm, one in which Joel Jr. could justify the unthinkable. In his mind, his parents were no longer the loving caretakers they had been throughout his life. They were an obstacle separating him from an inheritance and his own warped vision of stability. Thanksgiving 2016 marked the last time the family would gather together. And for Joel Sr. and Lisa, it was the last chance they would ever have to see life through the simple lens of tradition and togetherness. What lay beneath the surface of their family dynamic, decades of financial dependency, misplaced trust, and unchecked resentment, was festering to its breaking point in Joel Jr. It wasn't just financial independence he feared. It was losing control, something he had been determined to avoid at any cost. A goodbye hug, a polite thank you, and the closing of a door. That was how Joel Jr. left his family's Knoxville home. What no one realized, and what no one could have imagined, was how much darker that goodbye would soon become. Tucked among Joel Jr.'s belongings, investigators found a plain black notebook. At a glance, it might have looked innocuous, like a place to jot down shopping lists or reminders. But as detectives flipped through the pages, it quickly became clear that the writing inside wasn't ordinary. This notebook, later referred to by some as the Book of Premeditation, was far more than paper and ink. It was a window into the chilling mind of a son who had plotted to murder his parents down to the smallest detail. The notebook's contents were meticulously organized, almost unsettlingly so. Investigators pored over pages that read like a step-by-step guide to committing the crime, concealing it, and securing the rewards Joel Jr. believed he was entitled to. The details exposed not just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. One entry read, "Minimize things I touch throughout visit," a systematic reminder to avoid leaving fingerprints. He even made a point to write down that gloves and socks should be worn at all times in the house, to prevent forensic evidence like fingerprints or footprints from being traced back to him. It was disturbingly clinical, devoid of emotion, as though he were preparing for an exam rather than murder. Other notes outlined parts of his broader plan, each line revealing a new layer of premeditation. One disturbing instruction directed him to drop something down the garbage disposal to break it, and then get him on the ground fixing it, hinting at a staged distraction to lure his father into a vulnerable position. Joel Jr. had also written, "Clean up mess from him before she gets home," clearly showing his timeline for handling the aftermath of his father's murder before his mother, Lisa, would return to the house. The phrasing was detached, matter of fact, as though he saw this as just another checklist to complete. But the entries didn't stop at the logistics of when and where to attack. Joel Jr. had even considered how to dispose of his parents' remains. He made notes about grinding up body parts using tools like a blender and food grinder, both of which he intended to bring for this explicit purpose. The notebook revealed his grim plan to make them disappear entirely, an attempt to erase all physical evidence that Joel Sr. and Lisa had ever existed. The level of detail was simultaneously staggering and horrifying. He considered every step, even meticulously noting how he would clean up and prevent anyone from suspecting him. Beyond these chilling instructions, the notebook revealed another layer to Joel Jr.'s motivation. Money. It wasn't something casually appended to his plans, it was the very foundation of his reasoning. Handwritten calculations outlined the life insurance policies Joel Sr. and Lisa held. The math was simple. If they were no longer alive, he would gain access to significant payouts. Investigators highlighted portions where Joel Jr. spelled out his intent with shocking directness. Life insurance served as the financial solution he believed would replace the financial support that was about to end. The end of their lives, in his warped reasoning, translated to his continued financial security. The money wasn't just mentioned, it was the driving force. Notes in the notebook showed Joel Jr. actively planning how to ensure he received the payout. He wrote about making sure that the deaths looked like anything but murder until his plans shifted to achieving a complete destruction of their remains. Calculations accompanied these intentions, giving investigators a clear idea of his thinking leading up to the crime. In Joel Jr.'s mind, this wasn't about revenge or an emotional outburst. It was a cold, transactional plan where his parents' lives were simply a means to an end. There was even an entry about covering evidence of decomposition. Joel Jr. had written instructions to turn up the thermostat to its highest setting, attempting to accelerate the breakdown of tissues. He hoped the resulting conditions in the house would make forensic work difficult and throw off the timeline of death. The plan, while methodical in thought, also revealed alarming gaps in understanding. While Joel Jr. believed he had factored in everything needed to get away with murder, he underestimated science and human error. The notebook tied various threads of the crime together. As detectives examined receipts, surveillance footage, and items found at the crime scene, they discovered that Joel Jr. hadn't just crafted a theoretical plan, he had actively purchased the tools he intended to use. The combination of evidence transformed these pages into a script for his crime and connected him directly to the horrifying acts committed. The prosecution later used the notebook as a pivotal piece of evidence. In court, it became clear that these were not the actions of a person who snapped under the pressure of a moment. Instead, the notebook painted the picture of someone who had coldly, meticulously orchestrated a plan over time. It was an effective argument for premeditation, removing any uncertainty in the minds of the jury. But as comprehensive as it seemed, the notebook also highlighted how Joel Jr.'s obsessively detailed nature contributed to his downfall. Instead of leaving an untraceable crime scene, he created a blueprint that prosecutors could follow. Where the dismembered remains, chemical attempts at decomposition, and bloody messes might have told a disorganized story, the notebook provided clarity. Its presence cast a spotlight on his motives, his decisions, and every specific action he took leading up to the crime. A particularly chilling detail revealed in court was Joel Jr.'s consideration of staging the scene to implicate his father, Joel Sr., as the perpetrator. Included in the notebook were notes on potential ways to manipulate the evidence so that it might look like a violent dispute had taken place between his parents, one ending in mutual tragedy. This, paired with his overarching plans for destruction, demonstrated that Joel Jr. had given extensive thought to how to further distance himself from suspicion. These manipulative tactics only reinforced the depth of his premeditation. As prosecutors laid out their case, the notebook became a cornerstone of their argument. It didn't just speak to guilt, it spoke to intent, calculation, and a complete absence of remorse. Forensic analysts walked the court through each numbered list of actions in the notebook, showing how many of them corresponded with items recovered from the crime scene. Whether it was the chemicals intended to dissolve human remains or the gloves he used to cover his tracks, the notebook served as a damning companion to the already substantial physical evidence. Investigators also used it to confirm much of Joel Jr.'s timeline. From the purchases he made leading up to Thanksgiving to the actions he took on the day of the murders, it clearly lined up. Even his internet search history, which documented shockingly explicit research into decomposition and body disposal methods, matched the strategies outlined in his notes. Together with the notebook, this digital evidence created an airtight case. There was no doubt about who had committed the crime, nor was there any question of why. For the jury, the notebook was an unfiltered look into Joel Jr.'s psyche. It was difficult for anyone to imagine a son not only considering his parents' deaths, but planning them with such cold precision. The implications the notebook held were undeniable. He had thought of every possible obstacle to accomplishing his goals and reducing the likelihood of getting caught. But even as Joel Jr. meticulously planned, he underestimated the complexity of the systems he tried to outsmart. His attempts to dissolve the bodies fell short, leaving obvious physical evidence. His decision to leave the notebook behind exposed everything he had worked so hard to conceal. Instead of erasing his fingerprints, he wrote a roadmap to his guilt. In his arrogance, or perhaps his desperation, Joel Jr. had effectively handed investigators the most vital piece of the puzzle. By the time closing arguments were made at the trial, the notebook had left its mark on everyone involved. It not only illuminated Joel Jr.'s crystal-clear intention, but also painted a chilling picture of how far he was willing to go. By outlining his every move and motivation, the pages ensured that his parents' story and the horrifying truth of their deaths would be known to the world. As the judge reviewed the case and the jury considered their verdict, Joel Jr.'s notebook was undeniably central to the process. Its meticulous details and financial motive turned what might have been a murky investigation into one supported by overwhelming evidence. For detectives, prosecutors, and even the family grieving unimaginable loss, this notebook was both a grim reminder of what had been taken and the proof they needed to ensure justice. It wasn't just a record of a crime. It was the key that ensured Joel Jr.'s life outside of prison had come to an end, just as coldly as he had planned the end of his parents. The notebook's revelations horrifying and methodical as they were, showed exactly how far a person could go and exactly how far the evidence would take the case. Weeks before the murders, Joel Michael Guy Jr. began laying the foundation for what would soon unfold in his family's Knoxville home. Investigators later uncovered a disturbing paper trail of receipts, coupled with surveillance footage, that showed Joel Jr. acquiring the tools he believed he needed to carry out his plan. It was clear he hadn't acted impulsively. Instead, with cold and deliberate steps, he prepared for the unthinkable. On November 26, 2016, just 2 days after Thanksgiving, Joel Jr. walked into a Walmart in Knoxville. Security cameras captured his every move as he made carefully selected purchases that, on their own, may have seemed innocuous. He picked up chemicals, including large bottles of bleach, antiseptic products, and several packs of disposable gloves. Alongside these, he bought first aid items such as bandages and even ointments, which suggested he was aware that the task ahead might leave him injured. What stood out most were items that went far beyond basic household needs. Receipts showed he also purchased a meat grinder, a striking choice that would only make sense in the context of what investigators would later find in the family's home. Joel Jr. actions weren't limited to Walmart. Over the coming days, more purchases added to the picture of his planning. Investigators traced a shopping spree that included industrial-strength cleaning products and chemicals commonly associated with destroying biological materials. Sodium hydroxide and sulfuric acid, substances far more caustic than anything for typical household cleaning, were among these items. These chemicals are known to break down organic matter. Combined with the specific items written in his notebook, it was evident that Joel Jr. planned to use these agents to dissolve his parents' remains. Detectives later reviewed additional evidence from his digital footprint, which revealed an unnerving trail of online activity. Joel Jr. had conducted internet searches for products and substances that aligned closely with his purchases. He looked up information on sodium percarbonate, the active ingredient in OxyClean, for its supposed ability to remove DNA and tissue traces. Discussions among crime analysts concluded that this combination of physical items and online searches painted an undeniable picture. Joel Jr. had been methodical in planning the murders and erasure of evidence. Back at the crime scene, these seemingly disconnected purchases came together. The bleach, gloves, and cleaning products were stacked near bloodied towels, stained floors, and partially dissolved remains that Joel Jr. had failed to adequately conceal. The meat grinder was found among tools that still carried traces of human hair and tissue, proof that Joel Jr. had, to some extent, followed through on the directions in his notebook. The most horrifying connection was between the chemicals he researched and the state of his parents' bodies. They had been subjected to attempts at disintegration, though incomplete. Left behind were liquids and flesh remnants that provided forensic scientists with enough material to reconstruct what had happened. Surveillance footage also made Joel Jr.'s timeline increasingly clear. Several of these purchases were confirmed to have been made in the days leading up to Thanksgiving. On the day of his Walmart trip, there was little about his behavior that raised alarm. He moved through the aisles with purpose, but without visible signs of stress or panic. Even as his shopping cart became increasingly loaded with suspicious items, there was no hesitation or attempt to mask his identity captured on the store's cameras. For investigators, these images later served as both an indictment of his premeditation and his unsettling calm as he prepared for such a violent act. The notebook that was discovered in his belongings further tied these preparations together with chilling directness. Within its pages, Joel Jr. had outlined the materials he needed, many of which matched the receipts found during the investigation. He had even noted the chemicals by name and their intended purpose. In one section, his instructions mirrored the purchases he made for dissolving organic matter, leaving behind nothing that could be traced back to him. Investigators placed this information alongside the items in the home and confirmed that many of these tools had been used. According to experts at the trial, the detail in the notebook left no room for ambiguity. It wasn't just a theoretical plan. It was a plan he executed. Joel Jr. not only prepared to kill, but also seemed to anticipate the complications that might arise during the act or its aftermath. The purchase of bandages and first aid supplies suggested that he planned for the physical toll this act might take on him. Investigators would later note the presence of bandages stained with blood that wasn't his parents'. Joel Jr.'s preparation seemed to extend to every potential problem he might encounter, though his ability to control the aftermath left much to be desired. These missteps provided investigators with overwhelming evidence that tied him to the scene. The sheer quantity of cleaning supplies Joel Jr. purchased raised another red flag during the investigation. Detergents, chemical agents, and tools like scrub brushes and sponges were still sitting unused in the family home. Some were unpacked, just waiting for deployment, while others were stained with the failed attempts to clean up. For detectives and prosecutors, this emphasized that the planning had gone far beyond impulse. Joel Jr. had envisioned a scenario in which thorough cleaning and chemical disposal would mask his crime, leaving no trace of what occurred in his wake. What Joel Jr. didn't account for, however, were the elements beyond his control. The receipt trail documenting his purchases was damning. Combined with the surveillance footage, each item was matched to very specific moments in the lead-up to the murders. This kind of evidence left no space for Joel Jr. to argue an alternate narrative. There was no way these purchases were coincidental or unrelated. By connecting himself to the tools of the crime, he undermined his hopes of avoiding detection. Another misstep was failing to dispose of the incriminating evidence he'd left behind, including the notebook itself. The notebook, already damning for its detailed instructions, also outlined preventative measures he never fully carried out. Phrases such as "minimize things I touch" indicated a desire to avoid leaving behind fingerprints, yet forensic teams discovered gloves with his DNA inside and bloodstains connecting him to the entire crime scene. Investigators described this as evidence of his disorganization when it came to execution, contrasting sharply with the meticulous way he had prepared leading up to Thanksgiving. Every item Joel Jr. had acquired, from caustic chemicals to bandages, wound up as evidence to illustrate how much thought he had put into the act. The materials purchased were seemingly designed to dispose of his parents and any connection back to him, but his inability to complete this step entirely left those same items as undeniable links to his guilt. This wasn't a case of a spontaneous act or a split-second decision. Joel Jr. had calculated the process days, even weeks before he returned home for Thanksgiving. He had considered the tools, the methods, and the potential outcomes, ensuring that when the moment came, he would be as prepared as possible to dismantle the lives of the two people who had supported him for nearly 30 years. The clarity with which his premeditation was documented in receipts, surveillance footage, and collected materials left no doubt in the investigation. Prosecutors would later emphasize this evidence during the trial, showing the jury that Joel Jr. wasn't swept up in temporary anger or confusion. He had plotted each step, from the tools he needed to the aftermath he'd clean up. His preparation became the foundation for the case against him, a case that painted him as a cold, calculating killer who sought financial gain above all else. As investigators pieced together this series of actions, they noted how Joel Jr. appeared to approach every stage of the crime like an equation. If he followed certain steps and accounted for certain variables, he seemed to believe he could erase the crime completely, leaving nothing for anyone to find. What he failed to see, however, was the amount of evidence he'd leave behind, not just in the physical world but in the very preparation he had so carefully laid out. While Joel Jr.'s readiness highlighted the chilling depth of his planning, it was this preparation itself that dismantled any possibility of escaping justice. When the day of the murders came, Joel Jr. wasn't making impromptu decisions. His actions followed the blueprint he'd been piecing together for days, maybe weeks. The receipts, the footage, the notebook, they were all evidence not of someone stumbling into horrific acts, but of a son who chose to abandon love and humanity in favor of his own grim self-preservation. Joel Jr.'s preparations may have reflected a calculated mind, but they also revealed just how cruel and deliberate he had been in what he called the solution to his financial problems. Joel Guy Sr. followed a predictable routine on most days, even on that fateful Saturday after Thanksgiving in 2016. Upstairs in the exercise room of the family's Knoxville home, he often spent time working out, isolated from the rest of the house. The room, situated on the upper floor, made it easy for Joel Jr. to predict where his father would be and when. This detail was vital to his plan. The exercise room wasn't just a place for Joel Sr. to unwind, it became the premeditated site of his first attack. Joel Jr. chose this moment carefully. His father, unaware of what was coming, was alone, focused on his exercise routine. There would be no interruptions and no one to hear. Being upstairs added to his vulnerability. Joel Sr. wouldn't have had time to react, let alone escape. Joel Jr. walked up those familiar stairs with everything he needed in hand. This wasn't an argument that escalated, or a sudden outburst of anger. This was the calculated beginning of an unimaginable act. Armed and ready, Joel Jr. set his plan in motion. The attack unfolded with a level of violence that was both brutal and relentless. Joel Sr., a strong man in his late 50s, never stood a chance against the ferocity of his son's assault. He was stabbed over 40 times, each wound a grim marker of Joel Jr.'s intent. With every strike, Joel Jr. ensured his father couldn't regain control of the situation. The sheer number of injuries suggested not only rage but also a terrifying determination to finish what he'd started. Blood evidence revealed a struggle. Joel Sr. didn't go down easily. Despite being ambushed, he fought back, trying to save himself from his own son, but the element of surprise and the brutality of the attack left him with no chance. The room was left in disarray. Blood spattered across the walls and floor, marking the site of Joel Sr.'s desperate fight for survival. Torn fabric and disturbed furniture suggested he had tried to resist, but the injuries inflicted were catastrophic. Joel Jr. had calculated the attack so thoroughly that escape wasn't an option for his father. As investigators later uncovered, the notebook discovered among Joel Jr.'s belongings even hinted at this. Joel Sr. was to be subdued entirely before Joel Jr. moved on to the next phase of his plan. The notebook's instructions matched what unfolded upstairs. Joel Sr. was attacked and overpowered in a location that limited his chances of survival. Forensic evidence painted a clear picture of those horrifying moments. Joel Jr. had brought enough force to ensure the outcome he wanted, leaving his father fatally wounded. The attack was physical, intimate, and savage, yet it also bore the hallmarks of someone who had planned every gruesome detail in advance. Investigators later noted the combination of factors, both rage and calculation, that left them questioning how a son could commit such an act against his own parent. But Joel Jr.'s plans didn't end there. Once Joel Sr. lay lifeless, the methodical side of Joel Jr.'s plan began to emerge. He abandoned the physical violence for the more clinical task of covering his tracks and beginning preparations for the next step. His notebook suggested that every action was intended to move quickly. He had written about cleaning up and minimizing evidence, but the reality would turn out much messier than anticipated. Blood soaked into the walls and carpet of the exercise room, creating a trail of unmistakable violence. Joel Jr. may have envisioned disorganization as part of his father's resistance, but the scene left behind revealed his own inability to completely control what unfolded. Joel Sr.'s death wasn't an isolated event. It was only the beginning of what Joel Jr. had planned for the day. As his father lay dying, or perhaps already dead, Joel Jr. knew that his mother, Lisa, would return soon from her shopping trip. She had gone out earlier that afternoon, likely to pick up groceries or run routine errands. This meant Joel Jr. didn't have much time to finish with his father before Lisa walked through the door. Once again, the timeline in his notebook came into play. Lisa's routine, like Joel Sr.'s, was predictable. Another factor Joel Jr. had counted on when crafting his plan. Joel Jr.'s preparation for the murders wasn't limited to choosing the when and where. It extended to knowing how his parents moved through their daily lives. By targeting each of them at specific, most vulnerable moments, he significantly reduced the chance of being interrupted. But even with his careful planning, certain details began to unravel. The violence in the exercise room was difficult to contain. Blood pooled across the floor, dripping through to the lower level, where it created visible stains. It was a mess far greater than Joel Jr.'s vision of a clean, efficient crime would have allowed for. But there was no stopping now. Despite the overwhelming evidence of struggle, overkill, and planning, one unsettling truth remained. Joel Sr. never saw it coming, at least not in those critical moments leading up to the attack. His routine, one that brought him peace, became the very thing Joel Jr. exploited. This was a man who had worked tirelessly for decades to provide for his family and support his son's lifestyle. Yet his life came to a violent end at the hands of the same son he had supported unconditionally. As investigators would later theorize, Joel Sr.'s murder wasn't singularly fueled by resentment or anger. It fit into Joel Jr.'s broader plan for financial gain. By eliminating his father first, Joel Jr. was effectively removing the stronger, more physically threatening presence in the home. He needed to incapacitate Joel Sr. entirely to keep his plan moving forward. The violence inflicted seemed personal, but the intent was undeniably calculated. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst, but a premeditated act, part of a step-by-step plot to claim the life insurance money and rid himself of the financial constraints his parents intended to impose. But the knife wounds weren't the last marks Joel Jr. left on his father. After the attack, he began the methodical process of dismemberment, moving Joel Sr.'s remains to other parts of the house. While the larger task of body disposal wasn't completed in those immediate moments, Joel Jr.'s intentions for what should happen next became clear. The chemicals, tools, and equipment he had gathered pointed to a singular, grotesque plan to erase his parents completely and ensure no one, not family, neighbors, or authorities, would find out what had truly occurred. For Lisa Guy, however, the horror awaiting her inside her own home would become more than speculation. As she finished her shopping and prepared to return home that afternoon, she had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Her husband would be in his usual spot upstairs, and her son had come all the way from Baton Rouge to spend Thanksgiving. It was the picture of normalcy, at least for a family dealing with changes and challenges in their dynamic. Joel Jr. had blended into family life just enough over the holiday weekend to arouse no suspicion, even as he meticulously planned the violence to come. What Lisa didn't know, and perhaps couldn't have imagined, was that by the time she pulled into the driveway, her husband was already gone, the exercise room upstairs, stained with the evidence of his final moments. Joel Jr., aware of her routine, knew she wouldn't be far behind. He had targeted her next, just as coldly as he had planned his father's death. For Lisa, the return home wasn't the peaceful end to an errand. It became the beginning of her own violent end. Joel Sr.'s murder was complete, but Joel Jr. wasn't finished. His plan relied on erasing both parents. They shared everything, from their finances to their home, and to Joel Jr., this made them equally disposable. Lisa's arrival would begin the next chapter of the day's horrors, one that would escalate the brutality already inflicted and further cement the twisted nature of her son's motives. In a matter of hours, the Guy family home, once filled with memories of holidays and milestones, would transform into something unrecognizably dark. Lisa Guy's Saturday began like any other. She had left the home she shared with her husband, Joel Guy Sr., to run a few errands. By midday, she was at a Walmart in Knoxville, picking up groceries for the household. Unbeknownst to her, the trip was her last moment of normalcy and ordinary act of care for her family, set against the backdrop of unimaginable violence waiting for her at home. In the warmth of the Thanksgiving holiday just 2 days earlier, Lisa had been surrounded by her family. She had no way of knowing that her youngest son, Joel Jr., was already planning her death. Around the time she returned home on November 26, carrying grocery bags in her hands, the home she walked into was not the one she had left that morning. Upstairs, her husband lay lifeless in the exercise room after a brutal, premeditated attack by their son. Blood-smeared walls, floors, and even the staircase. A grim path that hinted at the chaos that had erupted. But for Lisa, the scene before her was as yet undiscovered. She opened the door and stepped inside, but immediately sensed something was wrong. Perhaps it was the eerie silence where there should have been the sounds of her husband's movements. Or maybe she saw the stains on the walls and carpet trailing through the house. Whatever caused it, Lisa's alarm set the next phase of Joel Jr.'s plan into motion. According to evidence later uncovered, Lisa may have dropped her groceries the moment she realized something was wrong. The sight of scattered grocery bags painted a grim picture, a household routine shattered by violence. Joel Jr., armed and ready, attacked his mother just as he had his father earlier that day. The ambush was swift and brutal, giving Lisa little time to react. Joel Jr. attacked her mercilessly, stabbing his mother 31 times. As with his father, the number of wounds wasn't just excessive, it was a clear indication of Joel Jr.'s sustained attack and determination to ensure she could not defend herself or escape. The violence of Lisa's murder was undeniable. Investigators later noted evidence of a struggle, though Lisa, like Joel Sr., had little hope of overpowering her son. Defensive wounds on her arms and hands testified to her desperate attempt to shield herself from the flurry of attacks. Despite her efforts, the injuries proved fatal, and Joel Jr. pressed forward with his plan, showing no hesitation after claiming her life. Forensic evidence suggested her death occurred quickly after she entered the house, an abrupt and horrific end to what had begun as an ordinary day of errands. The aftermath of his mother's death marked the start of what Joel Jr. believed was the most critical stage of his plan, disposing of the bodies. He moved Lisa's remains alongside his father's and began the gruesome process of dismemberment. This act was carried out not with emotion but with chilling deliberation. Joel Jr. was no longer attacking but attempting to erase the evidence of what he had done. Stains found throughout the house revealed a chaotic sequence of events, with blood dripped or smeared up the staircase, across banisters, and through hallways. It was clear that, despite his planning, Joel Jr. underestimated the complexity of covering up such a violent crime. After killing Lisa, Joel Jr.'s actions revealed just how far he was willing to go to destroy evidence and escape justice. One of the most disturbing elements of his plan was what he did next. Joel Jr. severed Lisa's head and brought it downstairs to the kitchen, where he placed it into a large stockpot on the stove. Investigators later found the stove burner turned on, the pot still warm when they arrived at the scene. This particular act, though shocking in its depravity, was not random. It was part of Joel Jr.'s calculated effort to make identifying her remains difficult. The attempt to boil her head served as a stark reminder of just how meticulously he had planned every stage of his crime. The effort to dismember and dissolve his parents' bodies didn't stop there. Joel Jr. used industrial-strength chemicals he had purchased in the weeks leading up to the murders, including products designed to break down organic material. He poured these caustic substances over the remains in an effort to dissolve tissue and obscure evidence. Lisa and Joel Sr.'s remains were placed in solution-filled containers, an act that was both methodical and deeply disturbing. However, this part of Joel Jr.'s plan proved far messier and less effective than he seemed to anticipate. Blood pooled around the containers, soaking into the floors and leaking out into the surrounding areas. Instead of concealing his crime, these actions created a new layer of evidence for investigators to uncover. Even after Lisa's death, traces of her final moments remained throughout the house. Investigators discovered reddish-brown stains on the stairs and walls, indicating a horrific trail of blood from the location of her murder. These stains stood in stark contrast to the meticulous planning that Joel Jr. had laid out in his notebook. He had envisioned a clean, efficient process, but the reality of carrying out such a violent crime quickly unraveled that illusion. Evidence of his brutality was embedded into nearly every inch of the home. The chilling nature of Joel Jr.'s actions didn't end with the physical evidence. His plan extended to ensuring that no one would recognize the home for what it had been, a place of family gatherings and holiday traditions. The sight of groceries spilled across the floor was a silent but powerful reminder of how abruptly he ended Lisa's life. She never even had the chance to unpack her shopping or notice anything more than the signs of danger before she was attacked. Joel Jr. stripped the house of its once warm and familiar air, replacing it with chaos and horror. Back in the kitchen, the sight of the stockpot on the stove stood out as the clearest symbol of Joel Jr.'s depravity. It was here that investigators later found Lisa's head, partially submerged in boiling liquid. The kitchen, often considered the heart of a home, had become a grim laboratory for Joel Jr.'s failed attempt to conceal his crime. This act wasn't just about destroying evidence. It added a calculated layer of cruelty to an already monstrous series of events. The choices Joel Jr. made after Lisa's homecoming revealed much about his mindset and intentions. Rather than express remorse or abandon his plan, he doubled down on the details. Dismemberment and chemical dissolution weren't acts of desperation. They were steps he had outlined in advance. These actions, however gruesome, were practical to him. Just another way to secure what he believed he was owed. By eliminating his parents, Joel Jr. intended to gain financial independence, but in doing so, he demonstrated a disregard for their humanity that was shocking even to seasoned investigators. As officers began piecing together what had happened, it became clear that Lisa's return home marked a turning point in Joel Jr.'s scheme. The violence inflicted upon her was swift and unrelenting, but it also revealed his limitations. His plan, while detailed, was far from seamless. Blood patterns, scattered evidence, and incomplete disposal efforts formed a narrative of a crime that was chaotic and ultimately impossible to hide. Lisa Guy's tragic homecoming, marked by scattered groceries and a brutal ambush, became a central part of the investigation into the murders. Her arrival allowed Joel Jr. to complete what he had set out to do, but it also added to the body of evidence that would eventually link him unmistakably to the crime. As investigators later documented, her death wasn't just the conclusion of a single event, it was the escalation of Joel Jr.'s premeditated plan to destroy his parents and secure his own financial gain. Lisa's final moments revealed both the personal impact of Joel Jr.'s actions and the unraveling of his careful preparations. Her death underscored the cold efficiency with which he carried out his plan, but also exposed the limits of his ability to fully erase the evidence. Even as he tried to boil her remains and dissolve their bodies, the weight of what he had done was left behind. Her homecoming wasn't just a moment in time, it set the stage for investigators uncovering one of the most disturbing scenes in Knoxville's history, ensuring that Joel Jr.'s attempt to conceal the truth would ultimately fail. After the murders, Joel Jr. began the next phase of his plan, dismembering his parents' bodies. This was not an impulsive act, but one he had considered and prepared for in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. Joel Jr. had purchased tools and chemicals specifically for this purpose, each selected with the intention of destroying evidence completely. In the silence of the Knoxville home, the brutality continued as he set to work on making his parents' remains disappear. Investigators found evidence that Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy's bodies had been partially dismembered in different parts of the house. Bloodstains told the grisly story of how he moved their remains, dragging and transporting them from where they died to designated areas for disposal. The tools Joel Jr. brought with him were as telling as the stains that covered the walls and floors. He had planned for this exact outcome, following the instructions written in his chilling notebook. Incredibly, the process had been as calculated as any other step in his plan. The chemical agents Joel Jr. had purchased were essential to his method. Investigators discovered 2 blue plastic tubs filled with liquid and human tissue. These tubs, placed in the bathroom, contained a cocktail of substances meant to dissolve his parents' remains. Joel Jr. had chosen chemicals such as hydrogen peroxide and sodium percarbonate, known for their ability to break down organic matter and remove DNA. These agents were not selected randomly, but with the specific goal of erasing all traces of his parents' identities. Yet, despite his efforts, the process was incomplete. The tubs still held bodily remains and fluids, leaving forensic scientists with plenty of evidence to document. The scene in the bathroom was central to Joel Jr.'s failed disposal attempts, but the kitchen delivered the most dramatic and disturbing discovery. On the stove sat a stock pot, the kind you might imagine being used for family dinners. But inside was Lisa Guy's severed head, partially submerged in a boiling liquid. The burner beneath the pot was still on when police arrived, the heat rising up from the macabre contents. This decision to boil Lisa's head appeared to be another method of destruction, aimed at eliminating, identifying features and complicating the forensic investigation. Placing Lisa's head in the stock pot was not a random act. Joel Jr.'s planning and previous steps revealed that he had likely considered what features, like teeth or facial characteristics, could identify his victims. Boiling the remains was likely his attempt to erase these markers permanently, reducing the ability of authorities to piece together what had happened. However, like much of his plan, this method was far from effective. Instead, it left behind one of the most unforgettable pieces of physical evidence connecting him directly to the crime. Joel Jr.'s efforts to dissolve and destroy evidence didn't stop there. Items like cleaning supplies, sponges, and even a meat grinder were also found at the house. Some tools were stained with blood or tissue, clear signs of use in the aftermath of the murders. His notebook had outlined these tools as part of the process, referencing their necessity in simplifying the act of dismemberment. But while these items were retrieved and used, they contributed more to Joel Jr.'s downfall than his success. Each one linked him firmly to the scene. The process was grisly and labor-intensive, and the resulting mess highlighted the limits of Joel Jr.'s planning. Blood seeped from the containers onto the bathroom floor, staining the tile and creating overwhelming evidence of what had occurred. Despite his efforts to clean and dissolve, the remnants of his parents' bodies were impossible to ignore. Hair, flesh, and tissue all remained intact to varying degrees, fortifying the trail of physical proof against him. The use of powerful chemicals may have been intended to dissolve this material completely, but Joel Jr.'s inexperience or impatience left the task half-finished. Beyond the tubs and the stockpot, investigators documented reddish-brown stains lining staircases and floors, suggesting that Joel Jr. struggled to contain the evidence as he moved his parents' remains through the house. The same stains were visible on walls and banisters, creating an undeniable picture of the violence that had unfolded. Even with tools and chemicals at his disposal, Joel Jr. hadn't accounted for the sheer difficulty of erasing every trace of such a horrific crime. The motive behind Joel Jr.'s gruesome actions became even clearer when paired with his notebook. In its pages, he had focused intently on what he believed was necessary to succeed. The dismemberment and use of chemicals weren't just practical steps. They were part of a deeper attempt to sever all ties to his parents, both physical and emotional. To Joel Jr., their remains were obstacles to his goals, little more than barriers to overcome so he could ensure his financial freedom. His actions in their aftermath painted the picture of someone who wasn't guided by rage or regret. Each decision was coldly calculated and devoid of humanity. Despite the grotesque nature of Joel Jr.'s attempts, significant evidence remained. The stock pot on the stove, for example, was as incriminating as it was horrifying. Far from eliminating any identifying features, it provided investigators with a clear link to his actions. Similarly, The tubs in the bathroom served more as evidence than as effective disposal tools. Instead of erasing his parents' bodies, Joel Jr. created a chilling catalogue of evidence that documented his every move. The failure of his disposal methods extended beyond the crime scene itself. The chemicals and tools he purchased in preparation were easily traced back to him. Receipts and surveillance footage revealed that Joel Jr. had carefully acquired these items in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. These purchases included not only cleaning agents but also bandages, likely bought in anticipation of injuries he might sustain during the murders. His foresight and premeditation were evident in every step, from the moment he started planning to the hours spent dismembering and boiling his parents' remains. As the police worked their way through the house, the extent of Joel Jr.'s efforts became alarmingly clear. The hallway on the main floor, the stairs, and much of the upstairs were stained with blood, creating a path that told the timeline of his actions. In one horrifying detail, investigators discovered human hands at the end of the hallway, further underscoring the brutality and chaos of what had happened inside the home. These literal pieces of evidence painted a picture more vivid than any confession could. The dismemberment wasn't just part of his plan, it was the methodical destruction of his family. While Joel Jr. had prepared heavily for the aftermath of his crime, he underestimated both the difficulty of total evidence removal and the diligence of forensic investigators. His methods, caustic chemicals, dismemberment, and even boiling body parts, were extreme, but ultimately unsuccessful. In fact, many of his choices left behind a clearer trail that led straight back to him. The stockpot alone became a key symbol of his guilt, its presence on the stove so deeply connected to his attempts at destruction that it was impossible to overlook. The crime scene was so unnerving, so detailed in its evidence, that investigators needed time to process the sheer magnitude of what had taken place. The brutality of the dismemberment, the overpowering chemical smell, and the scattered tools all contributed to a picture of unimaginable violence. But among all this, the stockpot stood out literally steaming with evidence of Joel Jr.'s cruelty and failure. In trying to erase his parents, he had created a monument to his crime. As officers concluded their search of the home, they began piecing together the events that had led to this gruesome scene. Each stain, tool, and tub told part of the story. Joel Jr. attempts to reduce his parents to nothing had backfired spectacularly, leaving behind more than enough for investigators to build their case. And as they worked to uncover the full scope of what happened, they knew the case wasn't just about what Joel Jr. had done. It was about how he had thought he could get away with it. Joel Jr. believed the dismemberment and chemical destruction would clear his path to financial gain, but the evidence left behind told a different story. Clinging to the walls and floors, scattered in tubs and on the stove, was the undeniable proof of his guilt. What Joel Jr. had viewed as the logical conclusion of his plan was, in reality, the trail that brought investigators closer to uncovering the horrifying truth. Every detail, from the carefully chosen chemicals to the chaotic bloodstains, made it clear Joel Jr.'s calculated decisions had sealed his fate. The investigation into the murder of Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy began with a welfare check. Lisa, a dependable employee, hadn't shown up for work following Thanksgiving, an absence that raised immediate concern. Her boss, Jennifer Weed, became worried when several attempts to reach Lisa by phone went unanswered. Weed knew this behavior was out of character. Lisa was not only reliable but was also scheduled to attend a retirement celebration being planned in her honor. Concerned about Lisa's uncharacteristic silence, Weed contacted 911, stressing that something wasn't right. She urged the authorities to check the family's Knoxville home, noting that it had recently been listed for sale, making the lack of communication even more puzzling. When Officer Stephen Ballard arrived at the house, the unsettling clues began adding up almost immediately. No one answered the front door. At first, this didn't seem too unusual, considering it was just a safety check. But when Ballard moved around to the back of the house, something stood out: a missing doorknob. While it wasn't definitive evidence of foul play, it was enough to raise questions about what might have happened. Ballard took note of this and reported back, but Lisa's boss remained persistent. Despite the initial check, she called 911 again, imploring them to dig deeper. This second call prompted Detective Jeremy McCord to join the effort, and the investigation escalated quickly. During their follow-up visit, Ballard and McCord peered through a window and noticed something chilling: scattered grocery items on the floor, including perishable goods that hadn't been put away. This detail, small as it seemed, added weight to their discomfort. Lisa had been at ease returning home from her shopping trip just days before, so what had stopped her from unpacking those groceries? The two officers decided to enter the property using the garage door. What awaited them inside would cement their growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. As Ballard and McCord stepped into the house, it became clear this was not going to be a simple welfare check. The first thing they noticed was the intense heat. The thermostat in the home had been turned up extraordinarily high, almost as if someone was trying to accelerate the decomposition process. Along with the stifling temperature came a strong, acrid smell chemical, sharp, and unlike anything they'd expected to encounter. Ballard even reported a tingling sensation on his forehead, a physical reaction to whatever substance was lingering in the air. As they continued deeper into the home, the signs only became more troubling. In the dining room, the officers spotted firearms lined up neatly on the table, an unnerving sight under the circumstances. But the most shocking discovery came when they climbed the stairs. By the time they reached the upper floor, the heat was nearly unbearable. That's when they saw a pair of human hands lying at the end of the hallway. The sight froze them in their tracks. With no way of knowing what else might be in the house, they retreated immediately and called for backup. They hadn't seen it all yet, but it was already clear that this crime scene was unlike anything they had encountered before. The arrival of forensic investigators brought more gruesome discoveries. Upstairs, they found reddish-brown stains splattered along the walls and streaked across the stairs, telling a story of violence and struggle. In the kitchen, a stockpot was still hot on the stove, its contents eventually identified as Lisa Guy's severed head, submerged in boiling liquid. Further exploration of the home led investigators to the bathroom, where two large blue plastic tubs held what had once been human remains. The tubs were filled with a chemical solution, Joel Jr.'s crude attempt to dissolve his parents' bodies. Alongside the tubs, detectives found a weapon in the sink, further linking the upstairs site of the murders to this improvised disposal effort. From the onset, the evidence increasingly pointed in one direction. Joel Michael Guy Jr., the only surviving member of the household, quickly became the prime suspect. Police learned he had returned to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the days following Thanksgiving, a glaring red flag given the circumstances. Investigators placed him under surveillance, and, the day after the welfare check, Joel Jr. was arrested in Baton Rouge. The most revealing find at the time of his arrest was the trunk of his car, which contained a meat grinder. This gruesome piece of evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, as similar tools were located in the Knoxville home and were integral to his plan to dismember his parents' bodies. Forensic testing solidified the case against Joel Jr. The stockpot, teeming with undeniable evidence of Lisa's murder, proved that this crime was not only deliberate but deeply depraved. Moreover, chemical analysis of the tubs in the bathroom revealed traces of human tissue and blood, confirming that the couple's dismemberment was part of a calculated effort to dispose of their remains. Joel Jr.'s DNA was also found inside gloves at the scene, cementing his physical presence at the time of the murders. These findings provided investigators with an airtight narrative of not just what happened in the house, but who was responsible. The most damning evidence, however, was the black notebook recovered from the house. Investigators dubbed it the Book of Premeditation for how thoroughly it laid out Joel Jr.'s step-by-step plan for murder. Inside, phrases like "clean up mess from him before she gets home" outlined his intent to kill his father first and then ambush his mother upon her return from shopping. The notebook described in chilling detail how he would minimize evidence, including instructions to wear gloves and socks to avoid leaving behind prints. Most unsettling were Joel Jr.'s calculations notes about the exact amounts of life insurance money he stood to gain once his parents were gone. These notes made his financial motive impossible to refute. Surveillance footage further tied Joel Jr. to the crime. Video from a local Walmart showed him purchasing bandages and chemicals in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. These items, including substances like sodium percarbonate, were later recovered from the Guy family home and meticulously matched to both receipts and Joel Jr.'s own handwritten notes. It wasn't just the physical items that incriminated him. The timeline of his planning and actions became painfully clear. Forensic analysis reconstructed the sequence of events. Joel Sr. was attacked first, ambushed in the upstairs exercise room where he spent much of his time. The struggle left the room disordered, with blood indicating how fiercely Joel Sr. fought to escape. Shortly after, Lisa returned home, likely still carrying her groceries, and was met with a similar fate. She sustained 31 stab wounds, a testament to the frenzied and brutal nature of Joel Jr.'s assault. Investigators concluded she died almost immediately upon entering the home, with her body moved to the bathroom for dismemberment. The motive revealed through family testimony and written evidence painted a shocking picture of greed. Joel Jr. had relied on his parents financially for nearly 3 decades, and with their plans to cut him off becoming clear, he saw murder as his only option for maintaining his lifestyle. Authorities confirmed that a $500,000 life insurance policy was at the center of his plan, alongside access to his parents' other assets. Far from being driven by emotion, Joel Jr.'s actions were the result of calculated desperation. As the pieces of the crime began to fall into place, Joel Jr.'s guilt became irrefutable. The chemicals, tools, surveillance footage, and his notebook worked together to tell the full story of his premeditation. The crime scene wasn't just a reflection of violence, it was a detailed roadmap of his thought process, one that ultimately failed to account for the growing mountain of evidence against him. With Joel Jr. in custody, attention turned to building the legal case. But for investigators, the work had already been done. Every corner of the Guy family home, every discarded piece of evidence, and every line in that notebook revealed the truth about who Joel Michael Guy Jr. really was, a man willing to sacrifice everything, including the parents who supported him, for his own selfish gain. The arrests and charges were only the beginning of the next chapter in seeking justice for Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy. Joel Michael Guy Jr. sat in a Tennessee courtroom, face blank, as the details of his crime played out in front of the jury. He had been arrested nearly 4 years earlier for the murders of his parents, but the trial marked the first time the full scope of his heinous actions was laid bare for the world to see. The charges against him listed 7 separate counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree felony murder, and 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. For the jurors, it was clear from the outset that this case was no ordinary crime-mate, was a premeditated act of brutality from a man who had meticulously planned and executed the horrific deaths of the very people who raised and supported him. Among the prosecution's most powerful tools was Joel Jr.'s own notebook. Nicknamed the Book of Premeditation, the notebook documented everything, from lists of supplies to a detailed timeline for the murders and disposal of his parents' bodies. This cold, calculated document became central to the state's case. A prosecutor opened the trial by reading directly from its pages, ensuring the jury understood the level of intent involved. "Clean up mess from him before she gets home," one chilling entry read, referring to Joel Sr.'s murder before Lisa's arrival home from her errands. "Minimize things I touch throughout visit," another entry ordered, revealing an almost obsessive focus on avoiding evidence. The notebook was not just a tool, it was a window into the mind of a killer fully aware of his actions. In addition to the notebook, the prosecution presented over 700 pieces of evidence. Each item served to reconstruct the horrifying series of events. There were receipts tracing Joel Jr.'s purchases of caustic chemicals used to dissolve his parents' remains. Surveillance footage showed him calmly purchasing supplies at Walmart just days before the murders, including bandages and rubber gloves. The evidence made it clear that Joel Jr. did not simply act on impulse. He had been planning for weeks, maybe months, leading up to Thanksgiving 2016. Crime scene photos also played a crucial role in solidifying the case. The images taken from the Guy family home left little to the imagination. Jurors were shown the kitchen where Lisa Guy's severed head had been discovered, still simmering in a stock pot on the stove. They saw the bathroom tubs filled with chemical solutions and the bloodied tools Joel Jr. had used to dismember his parents. Each photo was accompanied by testimony from forensic experts, who explained how the evidence pointed directly to Joel Jr. It was gruesome and difficult to absorb, but every detail painted the same picture: a cold, calculated double murder. Throughout the trial, Joel Jr. maintained an eerie stillness, showing no outward signs of emotion as the prosecution laid out his crimes. This stood in stark contrast to the emotional testimonies from family members, friends, and Lisa's co-workers. Witnesses described the Guys as loving parents and hard workers, people who had dedicated their lives to their children. They recalled Lisa's excitement about her upcoming retirement and Joel Sr.'s pride in reaching a stage where they could finally take time for themselves. That future was stolen from them in the most shocking way imaginable. One of the most moving testimonies came from Michelle Tyler, Joel Jr., half-sister. She spoke about the kind, welcoming nature of their parents and the devastating reality of losing them in such a way. Her words offered a heartbreaking glimpse into the aftermath of the murders, reminding everyone in the courtroom that these were not just victims of a crime, but real people with families who loved them. Lisa's boss, who had called for the initial welfare check, also testified about her dependability and warmth. emphasizing how drastically out of character it was for Lisa to be unreachable. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Joel Jr. chose not to take the stand in his defense. His legal team attempted to argue reasonable doubt, but the sheer volume of evidence undermined their case at every turn. The prosecution meticulously dismantled any possibility of innocence, using Joel Jr.'s own actions and words to do so. The notebook alone provided undeniable proof of premeditation, while the surveillance footage and forensic evidence left no room for an alternative narrative. The defense simply could not explain away the calculated purchases, the detailed timeline, or the horrific scene left behind. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Joel Michael Guy Jr. was found guilty on all 7 counts against him. Each charge carried weight, but the 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of felony murder underscored the severity of his actions. When the verdict was read aloud, there was no visible reaction from Joel Jr. He sat still, as he had throughout the trial, showing neither remorse nor acknowledgement of the outcome. When it came time for sentencing, the court heard more emotional testimony from family members. They spoke of the devastation and betrayal caused by Joel Jr.'s actions. Losing their parents was unbearable enough, but knowing the killer was their own sibling compounded their grief in ways difficult to express. Many referenced the trust and love Joel Sr. and Lisa had extended to Joel Jr., only to have it repaid with calculated violence. The judge ultimately handed down a sentence of 124 years in prison. Joel Jr., his eligibility for parole was set for April 30, 2000, 136 a date, far beyond what he could ever hope to see. The sentence effectively ensured that Joel Jr. would spend the rest of his life behind bars. It was, for many, a measure of justice for a crime that defied comprehension. The outcome delivered a strong message about accountability and the consequences of such despicable acts. The trial gained widespread attention, not only because of its horrific details, but also because of what it revealed about family dynamics gone tragically wrong. Joel Jr. had been financially dependent on his parents for nearly 3 decades, and their decision to cut him off had triggered his deadly plan. The case became a cautionary tale, prompting discussions about financial entitlement and the warning signs of violence within seemingly normal families. The horrifying premeditation and the detailed steps Joel Jr. took to carry it out sparked debates about how this level of evil could exist within someone so close to their victims. For many true crime enthusiasts and experts, the case stood out for the coldness with which Joel Jr. approached every stage of his plan. The notebook symbolized a level of detachment and calculation rarely seen in familial homicides. It wasn't a crime of passion or impulse, it was a means to an end, driven by greed and selfishness. This aspect of the case forced those following it to question the limits of human morality and the terrifying potential for cruelty behind closed doors. Though justice was served, the legacy of the case continued to leave its mark on those involved. For the family, the verdict brought closure but not healing. They were left to grapple with not only the loss of Joel Sr. and Lisa, but also the reality that their deaths came at the hands of someone they had loved and supported. For investigators, the trial was a reminder of the many layers to a case: the physical evidence, the emotional toll, and the lasting impact on all who are touched by such crimes. As Joel Jr. began his life sentence, experts and audiences alike reflected on the details of what made this case so uniquely disturbing. In the end, Joel Jr. left behind more than the gruesome evidence of his crime. He left behind questions about trust, entitlement, and the unthinkable choices some are willing to make in pursuit of their own self-interest. His story became a grim reminder of how greed and resentment, left unchecked, can spiral into tragedy. But it also became a testament to the strength of justice and the commitment of those who work tirelessly to uncover the truth, even in the face of unimaginable horror. Joel Jr.'s actions stand as a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath unresolved family dynamics. His meticulous planning, documented step by step in that chilling notebook, reveals how premeditated violence can fester in silence. Financial desperation brought out the worst in a man who relied on his parents for nearly everything, until their decision to end that support became a motive for murder. It shows how money, when placed above human connection, can corrupt completely. Recognizing strained relationships and unchecked resentment is key. Reflecting on this case, it's clear how addressing conflicts early could prevent tragedy, even in families that appear close.